St Duloc's is a really significant building in the context of Irish architecture, not least because it's a church that's been in use probably for well over 1,000 years. And that's very much reflected in its architecture, which is something of a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, but which we can put together to piece some of the history of the building over the last millennium. We know that there was a church on this site going right back, certainly as early as the 9th century. At that time, it was probably a timber building located within a circular earthen enclosure. That's no longer standing, but there is an echo of that building in the earliest part of the stone church that still stands on the site today. That part of the building now known as the oratory. We can recognise that by its very steep pitched stone roof, supported by a barrel vault. Now, this type of architecture is almost unique to Ireland and tends to be associated with particularly important church buildings. Buildings either associated with royalty, such as St Flannan's Chapel in Killaloe or Cormac's Chapel at Cashel, or alternatively buildings associated with the relics of local saints. So for example, St Columba's House at Kells or St Muachta's House in Louth, in County Louth. We think that the unusual form came about because of the desire to keep the association with an earlier saint alive. So the tradition would have been that an early saint, here for example St Duloc, was responsible for building the earliest church. That would have been a timber church with a very steep pitched timber roof, probably clad with shingles, the steep pitch necessary to send off the rainwater. Now, when that timber church was no longer fit for purpose, there would have been a desire, because it was a relic of the early saint, to keep the form, and so it was translated into stone. It became what we know as a skeuomorph. You keep the form, but you change the material. So this became a signifier of a place of great sanctity. So that tells us straight away something about the importance of this building when the oratory was constructed. And we don't know for sure the exact date of the construction of the oratory. Most of the comparable buildings date to either the 11th, 12th, or possibly even the very early 13th century. Because many of the windows were later enlarged or changed in the oratory here, it's impossible to pinpoint the date accurately, but we tend to suggest maybe a late 11th, early 12th century date for the oratory here. And we assume that this would have been used as a chapel that housed perhaps the relics of St Duloc, maybe other relics as well, because certainly by the late 12th century, when the building is given to Christ Church Cathedral, there's no reference to a parish church here, so that gives us some indication as to how the building was used. Now, I've mentioned the continuous use, and although it wasn't a parish church, it seems to have continued to be used as a place of worship, of veneration, and we see numerous different alterations and additions to the buildings. We know that the oratory continued in use certainly through the 13th into the 14th centuries because of the insertion of new windows with pointed arches known as the Gothic style, and that allows us to date them to possibly the end of the 13th into the 14th century. Now, although we might take these for granted today, they would have been glazed, and glazing, possibly with stained glass, would have been quite expensive. So we know that money was being invested in this building and that it was therefore a place of some importance. Now, in the early 15th century, in 1406, there's a grant of indulgences to people who come to this building, which at that time was dedicated to the Blessed Virgin and the Apostles Peter and Paul, although it was noted that it was vulgarly known as St Duloc's, to confess their sins to an anchorite or hermit who lived here in the building. And in return for this, perhaps as they left donations to the hermit, this might tie in with an extension to the building around this time, because what we see being added to the western part of the original oratory is a tower, and I suppose what we would refer to now as a tower house, a fortified domestic structure, possibly to accommodate the anchorite, or potentially also a chaplain who is servicing the people who are coming to worship here at the church. This structure, again, the idea of having, if you like, like a dwelling actually attached to a church, is once more something that's quite unusual to Irish architecture. It's seen particularly around the Pale, that is that area around Dublin that would have been under English rule during the later medieval period in Ireland. And the Pale was becoming increasingly vulnerable to attack from Gaelic families outside of the area. And so buildings, and in particular church buildings, began to be defended. And this is why when you approach St. Duloc's, perhaps doesn't look like the typical church. It looks almost part castle, part church. The tower itself was actually provided quite commodious accommodation. It had 2 fireplaces, window seats, and also a built-in latrine. So whoever was living there certainly wasn't suffering too much hardship. Possibly also at the time we see the addition of a northern aisle to the church. There are 2 great Gothic arches inside an arcade that suggest the expansion of the church building at this time. Now this may have been to accommodate regular worship, or perhaps also to accommodate burial, because at this time burial close to the relics of a saint would have been particularly popular. And we know that in 1506 a local man, John Burnell, gave an endowment of lands in the area to fund a chaplain here at St. Duloc's to basically sing a mass for his soul when he was buried here in the church. He was known as a chantry chaplain. So again, we can see the various uses of the building, and very much reflected in the architecture. Now, the building is a living building, and it didn't remain static. So as the centuries progress, we see more changes happening to the structure. We learn very little about it around the time of the Reformation, except that it appears to have continued in use more by the local Catholic families in the area, and became one of the more important areas of pilgrimage in Dublin. It's mentioned, for example, in 1610 in the writings of Barnaby Rich as having one of the foremost important holy wells in Dublin, a very popular place where the local Catholics would recourse for worship. The worship at that time perhaps was transferred from the building itself more towards the adjacent well house, and we see various architectural adaptations made to the well house during that period, whereas the building is described in early surveys of the 17th century as beginning to fall into ruin. Now, interestingly, that's not the end of the story. The church building does seem to have continued in use in the 17th century, and we can see some minor adaptations to the architecture at this time in the insertion of quite unusual square or rectangular shaped openings quite low down in the fabric of the building. Now these have an unusual splay. In other words, they have quite a small opening, but in the depth of the wall it sort of fans out on the outer part and also on the inner part. So that's what I mean by a splay. And this is a very typical design for a defensive feature known as a gun port. Now that suggests that this building at some point, probably in the 17th century, is being used for defence. So that the tower house, the residential part of the structure, is being used like a castle, and the oratory and other parts that have these gun ports being used defensively. Also, possibly at this time, we get some alterations, for example, to the interior stair, where the staircases are moved around a bit, and over the original south door, a murder hole is inserted. And this is basically a hole in the ceiling above the door where you enter, so that if you're not welcome, nasty things can be thrown down on top of you. So again, defensive features that suggest perhaps an alternative use to the building. But it does continue in use as a place of worship, and in the mid-18th century we have references to pilgrims coming into the structure, turning around in what was known as St. Duloc's bed, and this was seen as something that was beneficial to childbirth. Also, placing your head within the tomb was supposedly a cure for headaches. Now these may seem like sort of folklore, but often as architectural historians we use these as evidence that this is perhaps an echo of much earlier traditions that are associated with places where saints' relics were kept. So again, this may well be an indication of how the building was used in a much earlier time, and the fact that St Duloc's and perhaps other saints' relics were kept here, and that various different activities to do with the veneration of the relics were carried out. Now, in the late 18th century, a new church was built onto the north side of the medieval building, possibly necessitating the demolition of the earlier north aisle. That building only lasted just under 100 years before the eventual construction in 1863 of the Church of Ireland Church as it now is, where worship continues to the present day. And it's designed in, I suppose, what we describe as quite a modest Gothic revival style, but I think one that is very sympathetic to the medieval style of the earlier buildings, and I think very much reflects the long history of worship that has continued here at St Duloc's for probably well over a millennium. Now move into the church and look at some of the hotspots to find out more information about the different aspects of its history.